I almost walked past her. The thing nobody tells you about museums, after the third room, your eyes start to glaze. Everything becomes old thing, old thing, old thing, and your feet hurt, and you're thinking about whether the cafe downstairs is still serving that almond croissant you had on Tuesday. My professor had given us the afternoon as unstructured exploration time, which was academic speak for go absorb something and write 2 pages about it by Thursday. I had been wandering for almost an hour. Beautiful, but hollow, notebook tucked under my arm, with exactly 4 words written in it. I turned a corner and stopped walking entirely. She was massive. I mean, that was the first thing. Not tall exactly. That's not like that. But she was reclining, draped across this rough-hewn block of stone or crystal, like she had been mid-thought when something slowed her to stillness. But present. The kind of presence that takes up air. The kind that makes you aware suddenly you've been slouching. The marble, or whatever it was, had gone the color of old cream. Her robes pooled around her in a way that shouldn't have been possible in stone. Fabric caught mid-billow, frozen at the precise moment before it settled. One arm resting against the rock behind her, almost casual. The other lay across her body like she was considering something. Her head was tilted the smallest degree, wreathed in carved leaves, and she had been looking out at the room with an expression I couldn't immediately name. I stood there longer than I want to admit. There were other people in the gallery, a pair of older women moving slowly with a shared audio guide, a kid maybe 12 years old, bored out of his mind, trailing behind what I assumed were his parents. Nobody else had stopped. Nobody else seemed to notice that something was different about this corner of the room, that the air here had a different weight to it. The place card said Veleda. I had to look her up right there on my phone, which felt embarrassing somehow, like admitting ignorance to someone's face. She was apparently a Bruceteri prophetess. 1st century CE. She had emerged during the Batavian Revolt, a massive Germanic uprising that pushed back hard against Roman occupation, and she hadn't just participated, apparently. She had guided it. She had predicted outcomes, wielded real political authority in an era where that should have been structurally impossible for a woman to hold. She became so mythologized in her own lifetime, the source said, that her people eventually stopped allowing anyone to see her directly at all. She withdrew to a tower. Her words passed down through intermediaries, filtered through runners and representatives, like light through cloth. The Romans eventually captured her, apparently one of Domitian's campaigns, and she was brought to Rome, though what became of her after that thins out into speculation and silence. History swallowed her, I suppose the way it does, and here she was, reclining, partially bare, wreathed, carved from pale stone in some French sculptor's interpretation of what a Celtic prophetess should look like, which is to say she looked like a Roman goddess. Because that's the vocabulary of European sculpture had, because that's always the vocabulary the powerful use to render the other. I knew enough from my art history survey to recognize the irony in that. A woman who defined herself in opposition to Rome, immortalized in Rome's aesthetic language. I wondered if she would have found it funny or infuriating. Maybe both. There was something in her expression, or what the sculptor had decided her expression should be, that I couldn't shake. It wasn't triumph, not Suffering, though. Not the theatrical agony you see in so much of this sort of stuff, the thrown back head, the dramatic contortion of grief. No, it was something quieter, closer to patience, like she was waiting for the room to catch up with her, like she had been waiting for a very long time and had made her peace with waiting. I opened my notebook, uncapped my pen. These 2 pages were going to be easy now. I'm Brandon.
And I'm Courtney, and welcome back to the Time Travelers Club. So last time we were introduced to Veleda, Terry badass, and one of the leading voices in the Batavian Revolt. And we left her at the height of her power, where she was one of the thorns in the foot of Rome, making it achingly painful for every step they attempted to take. But what comes up must come down. So before discussing the decline, it's worth pausing on just how remarkable the peak of Veleda's influence actually was, because it sets up everything that follows. By roughly the middle of the revolt, late 69 into 70 AD, she was operating at a level of political and spiritual authority that had essentially no precedent for a woman in the Germanic world, at least not in any documented sense. She wasn't just a respected local prophetess anymore. She was a figure of genuinely imperial scale, in the sense that the Roman Empire itself was factoring her into its strategic calculations. The coalition under Civilis had achieved things that most people on both sides would have considered impossible just a year or two earlier. Roman legions had been besieged and in some cases forced to surrender. Roman camps along the Rhine had fallen. Large stretches of the frontier that Rome had controlled for generations were suddenly in Germanic hands, and running through all of it like a golden thread was Veleda's prophetic voice declaring that this was how things were meant to be. Her tower on the Lippe had become something close to a sacred site for the revolt, a place of pilgrimage where leaders came to seek guidance, where tribute was brought, where the divine sanction of the enterprise was concentrated and made tangible. The Roman flagship sitting there as a trophy was a constant visual reminder of what had been achieved and what she had foreseen. At this moment, if you were a participant in the revolt, Veleda probably seemed genuinely untouchable, a figure so clearly favored by fate that her continued presence was itself a guarantee of further success. But 70 AD brought significant changes in Rome's situation, and those changes would ultimately prove fatal to the revolt. The civil war that had created the power vacuum Civilis exploited was over. Vespasian had consolidated his position as emperor, and he was a competent, pragmatic ruler who understood exactly how dangerous it would be to allow a successful Germanic revolt to stand. A Rome that couldn't suppress a frontier uprising was a Rome whose authority everywhere was in question. Vespasian couldn't afford to let that message circulate around the empire.
Yeah, I mean, he had 4 other people before him who taught him that lesson.
Exactly. If you let one area behave badly, everyone else is going to start looking at you sideways.
Mm-hmm. And this is Rome, bitch. They don't fuck around.
We don't play.
Mm-hmm.
So Rome began assembling a serious military response. Not the depleted, politically compromised forces that Civilis had been fighting, but a genuine organized expedition under capable commanders. Quintus Petilius Ceralius was appointed to lead the Roman counteroffensive, and he was a significantly more formidable opponent than anything the revolt had faced so far. He was aggressive, experienced, and crucially, he moved fast, not giving the Germanic coalition time to consolidate or prepare. The dynamics that had favored Civilis in the early revolt began to reverse. Roman discipline and organizational capacity, which had been temporarily disrupted by civil war, reasserted themselves. The Germanic coalition, which had held together remarkably well during the winning phase, began to show the strains that always afflict coalitions when victories stop coming. Different tribes started calculating their own interests more carefully. The prospect of Roman retribution concentrated minds wonderfully.
Yeah, and you see, it's funny because like when you read that part, or well, we're discussing that part, like it reminded me of two things. The first was kind of like with the Spartacus uprisings, right? And like any of those like those slave uprisings that kept the servile wars, they're called. You'll see this pattern where it's like they are thrown off and there's these early victories, right? They exploit the internal conflicts that are going on at Rome, right? Mm-hmm. Or Rome will like, oh, it's just a slave uprising, you know, we don't want to give, no one wants to take up arms against them because that's like beneath them. But eventually Rome gets their shit together and they'll always send someone competent. And then when that competent person comes in, that's when we start seeing the decline, right? It happened to Spartacus too. The other one is like you see it happen with Vercingetorix. You saw this happen with Boudica, right? Like these tribes, you know, who were potentially enemies at one point, all come together, and when they're winning, they're kicking ass, they're doing great. But the moment they start losing, because they're not a nation, they are not unified. They might have some cultural stuff in common, but that doesn't mean anything. You know, like mm-hmm. when, like it's all at the end of the day, they've got their families to worry about, and so everything has to continue to go well. And it's pretty much a war of attrition that unfortunately these people are never going to win.
No,
you know, like at this point, until they can unify. And like eventually in history, that's what happens. In Rome, you have these these migration periods where they cannot go back. It's like we have Attila the Hun up our booties and he's killing everybody, so we can't go back that way. Also, Rome has spent so much time just essentially hiring these people out that they don't really have a standing army anymore. That is their standing army. And then because of corruption, they're actively screwing them over. It's a good unifier at that point, but they're not like separate tribes anymore in that sense, you know.
Yeah.
They're fully independent. And they are all unified in that moment. Like 100% is like these people owe us money and we're already here.
Exactly.
So that's when, and Rome was at a position where it was just so weak it couldn't fight back, right? That's not what's happening here. There is this moment of chaos, like to say the least. Imagine going through like 4 or 5 presidents in a year because each one gets killed by the last one. Like by the next one, you're like, that's crazy. But that's essentially what's happening. But they did, like, Vespasian seems competent enough. He's got his own issues, but you know he's competent, so no one can deny him that. That's why he stays alive. But like, yeah. So the moment you have someone competent on the throne, you know, there we are. So getting back to Veleda, this is a fascinating and unexplored dimension of her history, of her story. What happens to a prophetic reputation when the tides turn, right? Like I just discussed, we kind of see what happens politically, what happens. But what does this mean with her prophecies, right? Veleda's authority rested substantially on the apparent accuracy of her earlier predictions. Roman's defeat had validated her visions, but as Roman forces regrouped and began winning engagements again, the implicit promise of those earlier prophecies that the gods favored the Germanic cause came under pressure. Essentially, it's just a reversal, right? Rome was like, oh God, you know, like the gods aren't with us. Their gods must be favoring them. Well, now it's, you know, Uno reverse. The Germans are like, oh, maybe the gods are not pleased with us, and their gods are favoring them, right? So we, of course, don't have any direct testimony about how Veleda responded to this or her followers process the reversal. Tacitus, of course, doesn't give us her inner life or public statements during this phase, because why would he? Why would he?
Yeah.
I
Why,
mean,
what purpose would Tacitus have for stating anything positive about them?
well, that and like, are you telling me that this Roman man, great man, didn't care about a foreign barbaric woman who was in power and cared about making sure her thoughts were recorded accurately?
Of course not.
That's crazy.
It's a
I can't
woman.
believe
Who
that.
cares?
Well, like, right. It's like it mattered when they were winning. The moment they were losing, it's like, and see, no one cares what she has to say now. You dumb lady. Know your place. It doesn't matter what you think, because nature has righted its course and things are in their proper place. You know, so but and he doesn't even need to say that part because people would know that intuitively, right? His audience. So but that being said, we can reason about it from what we know about prophetic authority, and how it works under stress, right? There's other examples in the world where we do have that, right? There are essentially a few ways a prophetic figure can respond when events stop confirming their visions. Honestly, just go to look at any modern cult. I mean, yeah. I'm not saying she's a cult. I'm just saying, like, it's a good example if you're looking for something recorded, because if you ever seen that kind of thing where it's like, how do they still keep believing him? Or that her, whoever, right? Like Heaven's Gate's the one I'm thinking about. They just change it. You know, they were supposed to be immortal, and then she died from cancer. It's like, oh, but she is immortal. Her spirit transcended this plane, and her body was just a vehicle.
She had to leave her body behind. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, right. I mean, I'm not saying that's what Veleda's doing. I'm just saying, like, it's possible.
That's the mindset.
You know? Yeah. So, like, there, if you're looking for like modern examples, there you go. So one way is that they can reinterpret earlier prophecies to fit new circumstances, kind of like I just said, right? You know, we're leaving our vehicle behind. That's what they called it, their vehicle.
I know, it was the weirdest thing. Just like,
because everything was like Star Trek. That's why, because it's like your piece of shit.
The fuck?
It's just, I'm like, okay. On the one hand, like, just like weird sidebar, I guess it's not necessarily the most, it's both like it could be unhealthy but also not unhealthy, you know, like the idea, like it could be very zen. It's like, okay, you know, don't get so hung up about appearances and things like, and how you look and how you're aging and stuff, because at the end of the day, you know, if you're a spiritual person, it's like you have the spirit that doesn't age and move, you know, focus on that, you know, and that might be like very honestly kind of Buddhist. I don't know.
I mean, it is a little bit, but it's.
But then on the other hand, it's also like, I don't care about what I do to my body because, oh, you know, like, yeah, I don't know about that either. I think, like, I'm just saying it's an interesting concept, but
no, and it gets reinterpreted through many different. But yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, so back to Veleda, not Heaven's Gate. So there's a whole different show for that. So there's that. They can also just double down, right? That's always a possibility. Our current administration does this one a lot. Literally you literally just gave yourself money and told everybody that they can't investigate you for your taxes anymore or your family. No, I didn't. It's right here. No, it's not. Anyway, right. So insisting that the ultimate outcome is still assured, even if the plan is harder than expected, right? So there's that too, and that's a military thing too, right? It's like, no, just keep pushing. Eventually, like, I mean, if you look at like any war, you'll find an example of this, right? And sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. You know, if it works, they go, man, he was just so determined, he kept with it. Another time, and then if they lose that gamble, because that's what it is, it's like, oh, they were so stupid, they should have backed out, and then they just couldn't see. It's like when Napoleon was winning, right? It was the same thing. When Napoleon lost, you hear like, man, he just refused. He was so stubborn, he refused to let go. Sure, it had worked 9 other times, but you only have to fail once, right? So,
Correct.
mhm. um, so then there's kind of like this third thing, right? Their authority can simply begin to erode as the gap between prediction and reality becomes impossible to paper over, right? Like it can, being determined in like war, it can give your troops a second wind. But if it starts to become a like World War One, where it was eventually like attrition, you, people just start giving up, you know. Um, and that can lose the battle, right? And the longer something goes on, the longer you're not winning. When we were talking about Vercingetorix against Caesar and Mark Antony, right? At first it was going good, but a month into that siege and you're contemplating eating your kids, you know, a little harder to just keep going, guys. You know, it'll be fine. You know, it doesn't look fine. So, so this is kind of where we're at, right? What we can say is that Veleda continued to be a significant figure through the middle stages of the revolt's decline, which suggests her authority didn't immediately collapse, you know, when Roman fortunes improved, which is good. I'm glad that they weren't burning her at a stake somewhere immediately the moment shit went downhill. This is partially that social and spiritual infrastructure she had built. The tower, which is also very good to keep you from being burnt alive. The intermediate, you know, yeah, it's helpful. The if nothing else, it'll show if they come down the road with the pitchforks and the torches. You got some time to get out of Dodge, but you know. So there's that tower, the intermediary system, right? The accumulated weight of her accurate predictions, which I would almost argue too that the intermediary system, it almost kind of acts as a last. This is the little bit of a pessimist, I guess, in me. Like maybe like I don't know. I'm not a pessimistic person, but it creeps in the skeptic where I'm like, also if there's an intermediary, you could always just say, oh, she must have gotten it mixed up. That's not what I said. It's like literally shoot the messenger because I didn't say that. Ooh. But yeah, I hopefully she wasn't like that. But you know, I'm just saying. But that being said, that was all this like credibility didn't evaporate overnight. But that reserve was finite, and it was being drawn down. One of the most damaging developments for the revolt as it progressed was the fragmentation of that Germanic coalition. And this is where Veleda's diplomatic role became tragically relevant. In the early revolt, her ability to arbitrate between tribes and provide a unifying spiritual mandate had been one of the coalition's greatest strengths. But as the military pressure from Rome increased and the prospect of victory dimmed, the centrifugal forces pulling the coalition apart became stronger than any arbitrary authority that could counteract.
Well, it's hard to maintain that kind of power and that kind of confidence when losses happen. And losses were going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, in any star system too, you know, like if we're using that metaphor, I mean, the sun can hold things into its gravity, but the force pulls things apart the further out you go, right? And the stronger those forces are, you know, the more likely it is you can get thrown out of that orbit or lose those things orbiting you.
Exactly. And it's just I have to sit here and think, at what point did she possibly cave to pressures? Like every time they win, they're like, yeah, we won. She said that we were going to win. Did she ever have those second thoughts of, oh no, we're not winning anymore, but she can't say that we're not?
Or is she told she can't say that? Like, because again, while we think that she's powerful and stuff like that,
she's having to speak through an intermediary. We don't necessarily know what she stated at all.
Right. And then also, it, if she's becoming originally more, she was probably more independent, but as it becomes more important, like her words become more important for this greater structure, she might be telling them these things, and then they go, we're going to pick these details out because we don't want our men hearing that, you know?
Exactly.
Um,
And
or they're guiding it as in, like, you've got something good to tell us, right? Yeah.
exactly. And so I'm sitting here and I'm just like, it's, this is my head canon because this is what feels right to me. I don't know if it was her voice.
Yeah, it's hard to say because again, we don't have it at all. Period. We have Tacitus's report, right?
Hmm.
We don't even have the intermediate. We don't even have the German chieftains, let alone the intermediary, let alone her. You know,
Exactly.
so who knows? But again, like it's also that time period where she could have. We see it with cults too. Like they double down. She could have done all those things too. Who knows, right?
We don't know.
We don't know. It's just something to keep in mind. So Cerealis, the Roman commander, was shrewd enough to exploit all this, right? Rather than simply hammering the coalition militarily, he engaged in active diplomatic efforts to peel tribes away from Civilis. Because this is the problem with coalitions, right? Not everyone's at the same level of fervor. There might be some who had some more minor grievances, right? Or even doubts about joining, but they felt like they had to. And you find out who those people are and you start peeling them away. Because if you peel those ones away, the next group is easier to peel away.
Yep.
Right? Until you're left with just those diehards, which then you outnumber.
Well, then you can say, look at those zealots.
Mm-hmm. And right. So he offered terms, made promises, played on tribal self-interest. It's the Roman, like, just go look at their handbook. It's right there.
Agreed.
I mean, it's an imperial handbook too, but like the Romans did a really good job, and they were like one of those fierce people that people keep always going back to. America. The message was essentially Rome is back, Rome will win, and those who break with the revolt now will be treated more leniently than those who fight to the end. It was a classic Roman approach to suppressing provincial uprisings, and it had worked, right? The other thing too is like, also we have to remember this was by originally revolt, right? One group, specific group. You could promise another group, hey, clearly those Batavi, they're not working out anymore. How would you like all those perks?
Exactly.
Even if you don't offer them the same level of perks, they don't know what the original perks were. Let's be real. But they'd be like, "Oh, okay, like, why not? We could be the new version of that, and we're way better than those fucks. They've always been so right." And there you go.
And there you go. Now you've sowed the seeds of doubt. Now you've sowed the seeds of division.
Speaking of the Batavi, the Batavians themselves eventually entered negotiations with Cerealis. So Tacitus preserves portions of the speeches supposedly exchanged. I say supposedly because a lot of times this is just all hyperbole, and it's just meant to be like this speech is essentially the abstract of like everything they talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it makes it easier to read and more poetic. So anyway, Cerealis' address to the Batavians is particularly interesting, arguing that Germanic freedom was a romantic fantasy, and the tribes would simply fight each other if Rome withdrew. Oh God, this is starting to sound familiar.
Gross.
It's
Very
gross.
Middle East. Very Middle East.
There's a lot of this. I'm just saying, we like to emulate Rome. Anyway, and it's the British did too. It's like we're the new Rome. Anyway, it's not great.
That spirit hasn't died yet. It needs.
Right. This is like one of the core parts of it. That's what's unfortunate. So, anyway, So their thoughts were that the Batavians' genuine interests lay in their traditional relationship with Rome. And again, that's very abusive, toxic relationship. Like, look, babes, I know that was bad in the past, but do you really want to go trying to find someone new? Well, if they're worse, I mean, even if you don't date anyone, then you're alone.
You
Besides,
want
I
to
know
die
a lot
alone with your
about you.
cats.
Right. Besides, I know a lot about you, and I could really ruin you. I think it'd be better for everybody, and you too. Like, we'll figure it out. Just come back. We'll talk it over. Let's go back to the way it used to be.
Oh, my blood is boiling just off of
Rome,
that.
toxic X, guys. Your toxic X is also Rome. So
All of them are. Jesus
it's
Christ.
gross. It's gross. Anyway, so whether anyone found this fully convincing is debatable, but the military situation made the argument hard to resist, I suppose. It's like, it gets the equivalent of like he's beaten you up before and he's blocking the door. I just, I guess you'll say what you, and then you have to tell all your friends, yeah, it's fine. Like, we figured it out. Maybe I was a bit dramatic. And then all your friends just kind of look at you.
Side eye. Intense side eye.
And if you do that enough times, your friends stop wanting to hang out with you.
I'm sorry. Here's the thing. When you have somebody that is going through an abusive situation and they refuse to remove themselves from it and they make excuses for the abuser, that is so emotionally taxing you can't stay.
Oh no, and I'm not saying you should. That's, you know, that's very complicated. This ain't the podcast for that one. But I can understand. But that's the goal of the abuser too.
Absolutely.
To create that environment where people will abandon you. So it really, and it's not as easy as just, well, then just get out of the situation, right? Because they have also, again, create a situation where it's hard for you to just get out of it. Like, you know, you didn't want to pay taxes, and, you know, like, they had this arrangement, but then all of a sudden they just start like slamming you with taxes and making you do all this stuff you didn't want to do. And like, that wasn't the relationship you had at the beginning, and they told you, that's too bad because you've been in a relationship with me for so long. No one wants used goods, girl. Oh wait, we're talking about Rome. Anyway, so as the tribes began to peel away and negotiate separately with Rome, Veleda's position as a unifying spiritual authority became increasingly untenable. She had been the coalition glue, in part because she stood above tribal politics. But now, tribal politics were dissolving the coalition entirely. There was nothing to unify anymore. But yeah, so, and that's the other thing to think too, like, she was above it. She was above it. But the fact that even if to your comments about, like, if essentially, if eventually those prophecies do become political, right? They are politically motivated, and if that's happening, I mean, it's not really, that is the in between. You've lost that advantage to be. It's like the bias. It's a bias at this point, right?
Well, it has to be a bias at that point, because I mean, everything that she's talking about, everything that she's doing, these guys can see that every word that comes out from her tower, even if it's not from her, has power behind it. So maybe they're pushing agendas, but realistically, unfortunately, we don't know.
Well, and the thing is too, like, when we were talking about last episode and when we were talking about with the CRSs, right, and like Seder and stuff, like, when she's doing weather predictions, for example, right, you can miss one, right? Because weather is unpredictable. It's not personal. So therefore, you know, like, you'll probably get the next one, right? If you consistently keep fucking it up, that's a whole different thing. But like, people are way trickier to predict. And at this point, you're guaranteeing victories. This isn't rain. This isn't like a bad harvest or why someone might be sick or something like that, right? Where it's more subconscious and you're like, all right, I'm seeing these things and I've seen these signs before, and that means the gods are displeased, and this is how I know. Like, this is encouraging this goes beyond that, right?
Way
And
beyond.
and again, it's easier when it's like inter-tribe because you understand the culture. You travel between those cultures, right?
Hmm.
You know the people involved and the personalities. She's predicting Romans.
Yeah.
She's not allowed in that society. It's not her culture.
No.
She doesn't know anyone, right? Even she's only getting, and that's the other thing too, is even her predictions, right? She's not there witnessing the stuff. It's all getting filtered through her too. So even if you're not being like skeptical about it, she might not be even getting all the right information. They might be
Exactly.
telling her like, oh, like, you know, I like this administration, like everything's going great, sir, ma'am. Yeah, no, we're winning. Oh, cool. Then, like, clearly the gods are in favor. That's going to continue to happen. Let everyone know.
Yes. And
Um,
I'm actually going to posit something different. Um, so from the more spiritualistic divinatory side, Glorious, she doesn't understand Roman culture that well.
mhm,
She's from a Germanic tribe. So there potentially is signs and things that maybe was misread because she doesn't understand the fucking culture.
right. And then that's also political too, because again, it's all filtered, and it's not her culture. Doesn't under, even if she understands roughly their. Yes, I understand that they are a misogynistic culture who probably don't respect me that well. Do you really know what that means?
Yeah. Unless you've
Do
lived
you
it. Do you really understand it unless you've lived it?
like also like this thing like where maybe like when they say things a certain way, a Roman would know, oh, they're being sarcastic, they're being facetious, or they're lying.
Mm-hmm.
They only say it's like bless your heart,
In the
right? Like it
in the
doesn't actually
South,
mean that,
oh, that's you, dumb fuck.
right? Like so, like there's all of that we're not getting because we just don't have those conversations recorded. Um, the point is that it's real easy to be like, oh, like you know, if you take things at face value that she just kept making these predictions, but why? It could be it's just as easy to explain that she wasn't getting all the right information and like these kinds of prophecies weren't being done really before.
No, they weren't. They were done intertribally and for tribal conflicts, but not for an outside culture, not
And it's
for
not to
Rome.
say, and it's not to say that prophetesses or seeresses like and smaller tribes who had conflicts with Rome hadn't had that. It's just that they were so small and crushed that they weren't worth noting. This is huge.
This is a
So no
revolt.
one had really
This was recorded by Tacitus.
right. So the fact that it even made it to that level, right?
Correct.
No one had been, at least through the Germanic tribes up until this point, no one had really been here.
Exactly.
Um,
But let's get
and
back
when
to
we
it.
look at other stories, yeah,
Yeah. Let's get back to it. And yes, I completely agree with you. If we look at the other stories, it's just scale. Scale.
mm-hmm.
Civilis himself fought on with remarkable tenacity, even as the coalition crumbled around him. He retreated with his core Batavian forces, continuing to resist even when the strategic situation had become clearly hopeless. There's something almost admirable about the stubbornness of it. He had known from the beginning what Roman retribution would look like if the revolt failed, so he had relatively little to lose by fighting on. The final stages of Civilis's resistance are actually somewhat obscure in Tacitus's account, because the relevant portion of the histories is lost. The manuscript breaks off at a tantalizing moment when Civilis and Cerealis are apparently negotiating on a broken bridge, each on one end speaking across the gap. It's a perfect dramatic image, the two commanders who had been trying to destroy each other, separated by a ruined structure that symbolizes everything the revolt had built and destroyed. What was said, what was agreed, and what happened to Civilis afterwards is simply not in the surviving record. What we can say is that the revolt effectively ended sometime in 70 AD, with Roman authority reimposed along the Rhine frontier. The Batavians retained some of their traditional privileges. Rome was pragmatic enough to recognize that destroying the relationship with its best auxiliary troops entirely would be self-defeating. But the revolt had fundamentally altered the terms of that relationship. And this brings us to the part of Veleda's story that is simultaneously the most dramatic and the most sparsely documented. What happened to her after the revolt's collapse? She didn't simply disappear into obscurity when Roman authority was reimposed. Her story continued, and its continuation is both fascinating and deeply sad. With the revolt over and Roman power reasserted in the region, Veleda became something different from what she had been. She transformed from the living symbol of Germanic resistance and divine favor into a problem Rome needed to solve. She was too prominent, too symbolically charged, too potentially dangerous to simply ignore. Her continued presence in that tower on the Lippe, surrounded by whatever remained of her following, was an ongoing irritant and potential rallying point. There were Roman attempts to negotiate with, or around her, even as the revolt ended. At one point, there seems to have been Roman diplomatic activity that involved her. Whether attempts to neutralize her influence through negotiation or to co-opt her in some way isn't entirely clear. But these efforts were ultimately superseded by military reality.
Yeah, I mean, Lord knows from we learned from Cleopatra, and there's plenty of other women. You know, the worst position you could be in historically is a woman that was too prominent, symbolically charged, a rallying point in Rome's way.
That needs to either be put on a leash or neutralized and put into obscurity.
Right. I mean, so the decisive moment came around 77 to 78 AD. Notably, as you can hear, several years after the revolt itself had ended. A Roman military campaign under the governor Rudilius Gallicus moved against the Brutari in the course of its campaign, and Veleda was captured. So, I mean, just take that in for a minute. 7 to 8 years. She
Rome
gave
has a long memory.
But she gave them hell because it sounds like, you know, they've been trying to negotiate and everything else, and that's why you don't have too many records. I would gather, because they don't want to admit that it took them 7 to 8 years to take care of some woman.
That would definitely be very emasculating.
Like Cleopatra and Zenobia, right? Like, as soon as they lose, they got their ass, you know. And that's why, like, when Cleopatra unfortunately took her own life, or Zenobia, who was also, we don't know, right? Like, they don't let, like, they're real quick to, like, parade that around and give you an exact date, right? And all the dirty details. They don't really do this here. It's just weird. It's like we just said, they kind of just trail off and pick up when they capture her, and it's like really weird. It's like y'all, what happened in the 8 years?
What happened in the interim? How much hell did she give y'all?
I'm assuming quite a bit, because there's a whole new guy who's capturing her. Like, what happened to Cialis? I mean, come on. So, but captured she is. The gap in time between the revolt's end and her capture, like we said, is interesting. And we think that she managed to kind of maintain some kind of existence, some residual influence, of course, in the Brutari territory. And that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's good to know that her own people didn't abandon her, you know? Like, she kind of went back to the way things were. But unfortunately, she could not just go back to the way things were because she had done pissed off Daddy Rome. So, you know, But it does say she wasn't immediately swept up in the aftermath of defeat. And you could also look at it as that they were trying to chase down Civilis, so maybe she took the afterburner of that. And either he was captured or he died, or for whatever reason they had just given up on that, to then turn their attention on her, right?
Yeah.
But that being all said, it does say something about her continued significance and perhaps the difficulty Rome had of getting their hands on her. But captured she eventually was, and she was taken to Rome. The fact that she was taken to Rome rather than simply executed is also on the spot is also significant, right? Mm-hmm. Rome frequently brought prestigious captives back to the capital. It was part of how the empire displayed its power and the universality of its reach. Bringing a famous Germanic seeress to Rome was a statement. Even this woman, who had predicted our defeats, inspired our enemies, is now in our hands. It was a living demonstration of Rome's supremacy over the forces that had just briefly threatened the Rhine frontier. I also learned something, and I don't love this.
Okay.
But I'm just going to throw this out there. So I'm going to talk about Boudica for just a second. So one of the things that's really well known about the Boudica story is the reason she got big mad was because the Romans had sexually assaulted her teenage daughters. Okay. Now, that's terrible. Don't really need, they're men. They don't need a reason, I guess, right? But there is one note and one thought that is out there in the historical community, right? They were virgins, okay? As you would be as young preteen to teenage girls, okay? Of nobility. So Romans had this thing about virgins, right? That they're sacred, okay? Mm-hmm. Even if that's not your culture speaking, like, they're going to view that, right? If you're a virgin, right? So they can't kill you if you're a virgin.
Correct.
So to kill you, they'll just rape you and know you're not a virgin, so they can kill you.
And considering their thing about the Vestal virgins, they would also see it as a way of taking power.
So I'm curious if that, I don't want to think that.
No, but it's real.
Was it that she was allowed to go with a guard of her own people? We just don't. We're going to get into it. These people are brutal. If you're thinking, oh, they were super nice and she had to do a parade and sit with a sign that says I suck, but then got to live her days out in a villa, maybe. Whenever you hear about these stories with why did Cleopatra just end her life? She could have just lived out in some villa near Rome. Maybe she wasn't a queen, but I wouldn't mind that.
Yeah. Then it turns into... Then that would turn very, very quickly into I hate to use this word, a brothel.
I hate to even say, if we're just ignoring the fact that they have Starvation Island that they send their own moms and sisters to when they become politically a problem, let alone all the stabby murder that Rome is known for, right? This is also a thing you have to worry about in ancient Rome if you're a woman and a foreigner, or maybe not even foreign. It's not better if you are. So just throwing that out there for everyone if you didn't know. This is something they like to do. So Veleda, Rome. Our evidence of her presence in Rome is small. Small, I sound good. Small. But there is an evocative piece of poetry. The poet, Statius, writing in the 80s or 80s, a decade or two after her capture, right? Mm-hmm. Includes a reference to Veleda in one of his works, the Silvae, in a context that places her in Rome. In the fact that it's mentioned kind of casually to me, says that, well, we'll get into it. It's a brief mention rather than a detailed account, but it's enough to confirm that she did reach Rome and that she was known there as a figure of some notoriety. And to me, that says that you're not going to write what everyone already knows.
Correct.
Right? Like the president lives in Washington, D.C. at the White House. Like, hi, it's like, what I'm saying? Like, there's some of that, like, yeah, unless there's like actual history books that are surviving or something, but like, if you were like, oh, I'm going to Washington, D.C. to see the president, no one's going to ask you, well, where is he? Like, right. So there is some of that. What Stadius references also tells us that Veleda had become, by this point, something of a cultural artifact for Rome. A curiosity, a trophy, a symbol of barbarian otherness that had become domesticated by Roman power.
Ew.
Remember that thing I just brought up about Boudica's kids? Mm-hmm. Domesticated. Put in her place.
Stripped of her.
Pained. I'm not saying that it happened. I'm just saying it did not happen.
Exactly.
The woman who had terrified Roman commanders on the Rhine frontier was now an object of literary reference in the sophisticated social world of the Flavian Rome. That transition from feared prophetess to an exotic captive.
Ew.
Yep. But this is what they did. This was what all of these like different women's fates would be if they had had their way. And again, when you read it, the Romans make it sound like, oh, but like we're civilizing them. They get to live in this lovely villa. We give them the best stuff. That doesn't sound so bad.
No, it sounds worse.
And unfortunately, we have some of that language today where unfortunately women get sexually assaulted, abused, or whatever. And not just women. I mean, you can be anybody, right, and experience those things, and people will look at that if it's a person of wealth doing those things to you and you live in very good, quote unquote, good accommodations. Like, well, I wouldn't complain. You still see that kind of stuff today.
No, and you see that like, oh, but your husband is so well good. Look at your and it's like, look
right.
at the situation.
And they don't know, or even if they do know, they turn it around and blame the victim. Like, I wouldn't mind being hit on our supreme leader. That doesn't seem so bad.
Standards, ladies. Have some standards.
And from a personal place, as a child that was unfortunately had to deal with abuse, I remember that being a problem where I lived in a nice house with nice things in my room, and therefore social workers, when they would come in, would believe my parents when they said that they weren't doing horrible things. Only for then evidence to eventually come out, and then they go, oh, well, how we have known you had all these nice things, and we just assumed that they were right and you were a filthy liar. We still, and like you see it on murder documentaries where everyone thought these people had glamorous lives and then they end up dead. Like, there were signs, but we just didn't want to believe it. And so whenever you hear in Rome in history that they were allowed to live out in a villa for the rest of their lives, but their lives were unfortunately brief most of the time, keep that in mind. So also, this is on taxpayer dollars, so eventually when the taxpayers stop wanting to pay for that, you go away.
Exactly.
Usually. So, and with that, that's it. The record runs out. We don't know what happened to Veleda's life in Rome or what that looked like. We don't know if she was paraded in a triumph even when she first got brought in, if she got brought in. Was she kept as a curiosity by a Roman household? Don't love the sound of that.
Hate the sound of that.
Was she actually assigned some religious function? I doubt it, but I guess anything's possible. It depends on like if there was an actual negotiation. And that again, we don't have details. We could, and that's why they don't have details, where they got outbid by a lady and they actually had to give concessions. And one of those concessions was, I want to practice I'm going to live there to be a priestess for the German people living in Rome. Like, it could be that. And she was untouchable. That's the story I hope for, but we don't know, right? Yeah. So, was she just simply left to live out her days in comfortable obscurity?
I'm going to put that in quotes, air quotes, comfortable obscurity.
Yeah, right. We don't know if she ever attempted to practice her prophetic gifts in the alien environment of her imperial capital, or whether she found that those gifts, so rooted in the landscape, language, and religious framework of the Germanic world, had no purchase in Rome. We don't know when she even died, or whether anyone recorded her final years. The silence is frustrating, but also in a way it's appropriate. Veleda emerged from obscurity at the moment of the revolt, blazes with the extraordinary brightness of its height, and just like a kind of like a comet, and then fades back into that obscurity when the revolt ultimately fails. Her story is bookended by darkness, but that remarkable period of prophetic authority and political power illuminated in the middle of Tacitus's account.
What makes Veleda's complete story so compelling is the sheer scale of the reversal she experienced. Within roughly a decade, she went from being the most spiritually authoritative figure in a genuine challenge to Roman power, a woman to whom Roman commanders sent diplomatic envoys, to whom the greatest trophies of a successful revolt were offered as tribute, to being a captive in the city of the empire she had prophesied against. The gods she had spoken for had not, in the end, delivered the victory she had foreseen. Or perhaps, and this is a more interesting way to think about it, the victory she had seen was always more complicated than simple military triumph. Her prophecies had genuinely come true in the early stages of the revolt. Roman forces had been defeated. The empire had been shaken. The Rhine frontier had been thrown into chaos in ways that reverberated for years afterwards. Perhaps, from within her own prophetic framework, something real had been accomplished, even if it ultimately fell short of permanent liberation. We'll never know what Veleda herself thought about how her story ended. That interiority is lost to us completely. What we have is the external arc, extraordinary rise, catastrophic fall, and the knowledge that for a brief, remarkable period, a woman from a Germanic tribe on the edge of the Roman world wielded a form of power that the empire itself had to take seriously. That's not nothing. In many ways, that's everything.
I mean, I'll even throw my 2 cents in there. You know, the German people, a Germanic tribe would eventually destroy Rome. Mm-hmm. The Germans would liberate themselves, the Germanic tribes, not hers. Maybe not even in a way she could 100% recognize, but eventually it does come true. Rome does fall, and those different German peoples do end up going on to not only doing their own things, but like we talked in episode 1 of the season, forming their own kingdoms and cultures and empires. So,
yep.
Just there you go.
Absolutely. it does actually end up coming to pass. It
Mhm.
just
Wasn't
didn't.
in her lifetime.
No.
No.
The first and most concrete dimension of her legacy is what the Batavian Revolt itself changed. Because Veleda was so central to that revolt that its consequences are, in a meaningful sense, her consequences too. The revolt permanently altered Rome's relationship with its Germanic auxiliary troops and in its approach to the Rhine frontier. After 70 AD, Rome never quite treated the Batavians and neighboring tribes with the same casual confidence it had before. The experience of watching auxiliary units defect, of seeing Rome's best frontier fighters turn their skills against their employers, produced lasting institutional changes. Rome became more careful about how it recruited, stationed, and managed auxiliary troops. Specifically, more cautious about concentrating large numbers of men from the same ethnic group in the same unit or the same region, precisely because the Batavian experience had shown how dangerous that concentration would be when loyalty fractured. There were also changes to how Rome administered the Rhine frontier more broadly. The revolt had exposed serious vulnerabilities in the frontier system. The way the civil war at the center could cascade into provincial collapse at the edges. Vespasian and his successors invested significantly in strengthening their frontier infrastructure, improving the road networks, building more permanent military installations, and generally making the Rhine-Danube frontier more defensible and less dependent on the loyalty of local auxiliaries. The elaborate frontier fortification system that would eventually become known as the limes, the Roman frontier wall and defense network, owes something of its impetus to the shock of the Batavian revolt. None of this would have happened, or could have happened, in quite the same way, without the revolt achieving the scale and success it did in the early stages. And that scale and success was substantially Veleda's contribution.
Moving beyond the immediate political consequences, Veleda's more enduring legacy lies in what she represents within the long tradition of Germanic female religious authority. She is, quite simply, the best documented example we have of that kind of prophetic woman that Germanic culture clearly produced repeatedly, but that history rarely preserved in any detail. Tacitus mentions Aurania as a predecessor, which tells us Veleda wasn't the first. And after Veleda, the tradition clearly continues. We have scattered references to other Germanic prophetesses in later Roman sources, women who also wielded similar kinds of spiritual authority amongst their peoples. What Veleda gives us that these other figures largely lack is enough documentary detail to actually understand how that role could have functioned. The tower, that whole intermediary system, the relationship with military and political leadership, the way prophetic reputation was built and maintained. She is essentially the case study through which we understand an entire category of historical figure. This matters enormously for understanding the later Norse religious traditions, where the figure of the Volva, or seeress, is extensively documented in sagas and in mythological texts like the Voluspa, the great prophetic poem that opens the Poetic Edda. The Volva in Norse tradition is a wandering prophetess who can be summoned to perform Seder, a form of quote-unquote Shamatic magic involving prophecy and the manipulation of fate. And again, we go into this in great detail on previous episodes, so go ahead and listen to that if you haven't yet. But she sits on a high seat, which interestingly echoes Veleda's tower, and delivers her visions to those who seek them. The continuity between what Veleda represents and what the Norse Volva represent is not coincidental. They're drawing from the same deep well of Germanic religious traditions, a tradition in which certain women were understood to have special access to a hidden structure of fate, and in which that access conferred real social and political power. Veleda is, in a sense, one of our earliest and clearest windows into that tradition. She predates the Norse literary sources by roughly 8 centuries, but she is recognizably part of that same world. Any discussion of Veleda's legacy has to grapple seriously with the fact that almost everything we know about her, though, comes from Tacitus.
Yes.
And Tacitus, was, and we're going to drill this, right? Tacitus was a Roman male aristocrat writing for a Roman, probably male, audience with a complex set of agendas that shaped how he presented Germanic society. It's not, that being said, this isn't a reason to just outright dismiss his account, right? We have to remember he was a careful, generally reliable historian, right? Like I don't even think there's a bias there, right? Mm-hmm. We can all agree.
Everyone has a bias, realistically, if you look at it.
Correct. He is known for being level-headed. He's not known for being prone to fantastical stories, okay? But he can cherry pick details. There's still that 7 to 8 year gap. Mum's the word. But, so that being said, it is a reason to think carefully about what his account does and doesn't tell. Tacitus had a well-documented tendency to use descriptions of Germanic society as implicit commentary on what he saw as Roman moral decline. We see this today with immigration and things like that in the United States. I don't think it's that hard to imagine.
No, it's not, because they're going to write it from their lens. They're going to write it from their specific point of view. And they do see themselves as correct and, unbiased and everything like that. They see themselves as completely impartial.
But the idea that people who aren't like the hetero white normative, right? Like the Anglo normative. So all these Mexicans coming into our country, the drag queens that are reading to kids, the pronoun debate, and trans people being able to use restrooms like that, they feel, better represents themselves. And certain people in this country always point to those things and go, this is proof of moral decay in our country. We need to go back to these pure roots when everyone spoke English and everyone was a boy and a girl and it never changed, and all boys and girls were only doing each other and not the same sex. Newsflash, that culture never existed, but
exactly, that was a beautiful facade.
And people point to moral decline as being like, oh, well, that's why the government's failing, because they're immoral. This emperor is doing, these dirty things and, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll instate someone who is actually depraved as hell, which is always the irony of it. But rather than looking at, oh, it's actually because of a result of excess of colonizing, because that's the fear of the colonizer, is that the cultures they're colonizing will actually take over their culture. Reverse that situation, and they're terrified of that. So remember, America was modeled after Rome.
As I've said many times before, Rome never fell. It just turned into a religion.
And at the end of the day, here we are 2,000 years later, and the world's gotten bigger, and yet still we're upset that the neighbors that we're trying to colonize, that we view as better than ourselves, right? And we're still having these same debates.
It's gross.
Right. So, back to Tacitus. The Germania, in particular, is saturated with this dynamic. The Germans quote, the Germans, right, are, because they, as we've learned, they're not one group, but whatever, are repeatedly portrayed as possessing a rugged virtue, a simplicity and authenticity that contrasted favorably with what Tacitus saw as corruption and the decadence of imperial Rome. They're just, salt of the earth people. We should be more like them, but also us, like we used to be. And yet they're taking our jobs. Anyway. So in Germanic.
It hurts. It hurts a lot.
It's such a backhanded compliment. The Germanic women in particular are often presented as morally superior to their Roman counterparts because they were chaste, strong, spiritually serious, and uncorrupted by luxury, and they didn't give lip to their husbands. But yet they were also mad German women because they had the audacity to think that they were equals to their male counterpart, but whatever. Anyway, cherry picking.
Always.
So Veleda fits neatly into this rhetorical framework, though, which means we should be at least a little cautious about assuming that Tacitus' portrait of her is simply objective reportage. I say not. He may have emphasized certain aspects of her authority and her role because they served his broader arguments about Germanic virtue. He may have smoothed over complications or contradictions. The real Veleda, the one who actually lived in that tower and negotiated those tribal disputes, was almost certainly more complex and more human than the figure who appears in the pages. And we've talked about this too. It works both ways. He doesn't understand the culture.
Correct.
He's understanding it through a Roman lens. Oh, Absolutely. They must think she's a goddess. Right. At the same time, the basic facts of her involvement, the role she played, the honors she received, the Roman diplomatic attention she attracted, are corroborated by the logic of events in ways that make them hard to dismiss as purely literary invention. Tacitus may have shaped her portrait, but he didn't invent her.
Exactly. So for most of the period between the ancient world and the modern era, Veleda existed in a kind of obscurity, known to classical scholars who read Tacitus, but not part of the broader cultural conversation. The Renaissance recovery of classical texts brought Tacitus back into circulation, and with him, Veleda. But she remained a footnote rather than the subject of serious inquiry for a long time. The 19th century changes this significantly for reasons that themselves are historically interesting. The rise of German nationalism created enormous appetite for heroic Germanic ancestors, figures from the pre-Roman or anti-Roman Germanic past who could serve as founding myths for a modern German national identity. Arminius, the leader of the Teutoburg forest ambush, was the most prominent beneficiary of this dynamic, being essentially reinvented as a German national hero during this period. But Veleda also attracted attention, partly because of her connection to the Batavian Revolt, and partly because the 19th century's Romantic nationalism had a particular fondness for mystical, prophetic female figures. This is a double-edged aspect of her legacy, because the 19th century nationalist appropriation of figures like Veleda was often more about projecting modern ideological needs onto ancient material than about genuinely understanding the historical figure. The Veleda who appears in the 19th century German cultural imagination was frequently a romanticized, idealized version, more symbol than person. This kind of appropriation can actually impede serious historical understanding by layering modern assumptions so thickly over the ancient evidence that the real figure becomes hard to see. A more recent and arguably more productive strand of Veleda's legacy lies in her recovery by feminist historians and scholars of women's history, particularly from the latter 20th century onwards. As the historical profession began seriously grappling with the systematic absence of women from historical record, asking not just where are the women, but why aren't they here and what does that absence tell us? Figures like Veleda became increasingly significant. Veleda is genuinely valuable to this project for several reasons. She demonstrates in a well documented ancient context that women could and did exercise forms of political and military influence that conventional history has often assumed were exclusively male domains. She didn't do it in the same way male leaders did. Her power operated through different channels and drew on different sources of authority. But its real world effects were comparable. Tribal coalitions were held together by her arbitration. Roman commanders adjusted their strategies in response to her influence. Military decisions were made or unmade based on her prophecies. This challenges the still common assumption that pre-modern women were simply passive, that real historical agency was a male preserve, and that women who appear in historical record are exceptions so unusual as to be essentially irrelevant to our understanding of how ancient societies actually worked. Veleda suggests, rather, that female authority of this kind may have been more structurally embedded in Germanic society than our male-authored sources typically acknowledge. She's not an anomaly. She is a data point in a larger pattern that our sources only partially preserve. Veleda has made periodic appearances in literature and art across the centuries. Though she's never achieved the mainstream cultural recognition of figures like Boudica or Cleopatra, other women who challenged Rome and whose stories have been extensively retold and reimagined. The French writer Chateaubriand included a character named Veleda in his 1809 novel, Le Martyr. Though his version of the character is heavily fictionalized and says more about early 19th century Romanticism than about the historical figure. She appears in various German literary and artistic works from the nationalist period, usually in the more romanticized form discussed earlier. And more recently, she has appeared in historical fiction and in popular histories of Rome and the Germanic world, though usually as a supporting character in someone else's story rather than as the protagonist of her own. The relative thinness of her cultural afterlife compared to figures like Boudica is instructive. Boudica led a revolt that took place in Britain, which meant her story was claimed by British national mythology and given the full treatment of imperial self-congratulation. The dangerous barbarian queen who almost brought down civilization, defeated by Roman order. Veleda's story unfolded on the continent, in a region that became Germany and the Netherlands, and the national traditions of those countries developed their heroic founding myths around different figures. She fell into the gaps between national mythologies rather than being claimed fully by any one of them.
I would also say too with Boudica, because it is similar in the sense that they are romanticized by their respective cultures in the 19th century because of this the concept of nationalism coming out,
Yep.
and romanticism being a big movement. However, Boudica in particular really, I think, caught a hold in the imagination because of Victoria. Victoria was leaning in it. Look at this. She was a female British queen who had children and was willing to die for her people. You know, like the nation was her people, which was definitely something that Victoria was trying to push, because up until that point, really the only queen that they had was the Virgin Queen, and Victoria was not a virgin. Not at all.
No, not in the least. She really liked her husband.
I was gonna say, I don't like using the term, but nymphomaniac may actually apply to her. Might actually apply to her. I don't think, like, they try to paint it to the point with her too that, like, oh, like her husband didn't even want it. I don't even think so. But I will say she definitely liked the activity. Famously hated the consequences, but because of the activity, she had a lot of kids. So how do you paint that and still maintain this power, right? The idea that you are the nation, and she's like, I'll become the mother of the nation. So Boudica becomes that as well. She commissions like a very famous statue of her, which is very public, right in the middle of London. But I don't think Veleda got that opportunity, right? Because you didn't have Germany was just starting to unify. It was the Prussians who technically were that unifying force, and they had all male leaders. I don't think that quite. Well,
it's not just that. It's not just that. She was also separated from it and elevated from it because she was in the tower. She wasn't on the front line. She wasn't charging on a horse with a child strapped to her back. Like that's not the image that you get when you think of Veleda.
And Boudica, for the record, wasn't either. Like, had no children on her back by that point. But she is shown riding with her two teenage daughters side by side to her. But yes, that was a queen, a woman who got all the actively was the beginning. She wasn't who united those tribes, not as a shared position like it was her. She got up, she got on stage, she said, what are you fuckers doing? Are you tired of this shit? And they're like, yeah, we're tired of this shit. You go, girl. This versus like the Batavian revolt started with Civilis.
Exactly.
So it goes down to, oh, well, he was right. And she's a supporting character. Boudica's no one's supporting character. Argue that. But she's also mythologized, romanticized, right down to her red hair.
Correct.
So, and people get very upset if you challenge certain notions, right? It's hot. If a hot take if you say, I don't think Boudica was a redhead. That's their whole identity. It's wild. Point is that, like you said, all of this stuff, right, we have to take it with a grain of salt, because while we can appreciate that they're being elevated and being brought into the main, discourse of things, it's all done like they lose even more of their identity, oddly enough.
Yes.
Because, right, they become symbols, not real. So perhaps Veleda's deepest legacy is what she demonstrated about the nature of power itself, specifically how power can be constructed and exercised through channels that don't fit conventional definitions of authority, like a queen. Veleda had no military command, like you were saying. She led no troops into battle. She controlled no territory in any formal sense. She had no institutional position within any recognized political structure. By most conventional definitions of political power, she had none. And yet, Roman emperors factored her into strategic calculations. I mean, they spent 8 years looking for the bitch. Trying to get her. So
and that to me still strikes me as wild. 8 years looking for her? Yeah. Actually looking for her? Or
that's one thing you need to go find out. Like, what happened in that 8 years? Like, what really happened? Like, we need to know. Tribal coalitions were held together partly because of her arbitrating authority. The most prestigious trophy of a major revolt was sent to her as tribute, which, if you don't remember, because I don't know if we mentioned it this episode, it was an entire ship that they captured. Mm-hmm. The whole thing. Like a whole, warship, essentially. I mean, do what you will with that image. She was deemed important enough to be captured and brought to Rome like a queen rather than simply killed. She wasn't a queen, though. She's just some lady at the end of the day. Like, I'm sure she has a pedigree within her culture, right? We kind of discussed that too, but she's not a princess. She's not royal in that sense. She's just a lady who lived in the tower and people actually listened to.
Seems pretty royal to me.
It does, but when we think royals, right? Even princesses have value just because, and they don't have to say anything. It's because of what their bloodlines are, and she doesn't technically have any of that. Like when we think about like Cleopatra, Zenobia, Boudica, what is the thing that they all have in common? They were royals, so they had that authority.
Exactly.
Like, and that was powerful back then. And sometimes now too, where your whole family can be exempt from taxation. Anyway,
Correct.
her power, though, was real. Demonstrably, concretely real in its effects. It just operated through different mechanisms than the power we usually study, through reputation, through spiritual authority, through the management of access and mystery, through the cultivation of a prophetic track record, through her position as a neutral figure in a world of competing tribal loyalties. These mechanisms were genuinely effective, and they were available to her precisely because of the specific cultural framework she inhabited, a framework that recognized female spiritual authority as legitimate and significant. This has implications beyond Veleda's own specific case. It suggests that our historical categories for thinking about power, who has it, what it looks like, how it's exercised, maybe it's too narrow. Too shaped by the kinds of power that leave obvious documentary traces. Too focused on formal institutions and military force. The kinds of power that Veleda wielded are harder to document, but not necessarily less real than in their effects. And there were almost certainly many other women across history who wielded similar kinds of influence without leaving enough traces, or those traces were erased, for historians to reconstruct their stories. So finally, there's something to be said about the gaps in silence in Veleda's story are themselves part of this legacy. We don't know her birth name, if Veleda was indeed a title. We don't know anything about her early life. We don't know what she actually said in her prophecies. We don't know how she experienced the collapse of the revolt and her own capture, if it was even a capture. We don't know what her life in Rome looked like, or how and when she died. These silences are frustrating from a historian's perspective, but they also keep her story open in a way that more fully documented figures aren't. Veleda resists being fully known, fully explained, fully domesticated into a tidy historical narrative. There's something fitting about that for a woman whose entire authority rested on access to hidden knowledge, on seeing what others couldn't see. She remains, even across 2,000 years, obscured, mysterious. What we can say with confidence is that she was real. She mattered. Her influence shaped events at a genuinely significant moment in history of Rome and the Germanic world, and that she exercised a form of power that the historical record rarely captures because it doesn't fit the template we've built for recognizing power. Recovering her story, even incompletely, is an act of historical justice, and a reminder that the past was inhabited by extraordinary people whose names we've barely learned to look for.
If you like what you heard today, please give us a positive review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on. It goes a long way for us to appease the algorithm gods and get this suggested to others just like you. The more we can connect to our fellow history nerds, the more we can build up a community and keep this show going.
Also, we have a Patreon where you can hang out with us and get exclusive content, like videos where we might try to make ancient recipes, talk about topics that couldn't fit into the main arcs of the podcast. So just for some examples there, we've got the Fayum mummies, Atlantis, Hecate, and we've got many, many more ideas to come, all for the price of a latte per month. Research materials and books cost a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time to create this show. So anything you provide would be a huge help.
We can't wait to see you again next week. And as always, thanks for listening.
Bye for now.
Bye, guys.